Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by acknowledging that where we gather in assembly here in the Legislative Assembly is on the unceded and unsurrendered territory and lands of the Wolastoqey people. We're just a stone's throw away from the Wolastoq, the beautiful and bountiful river.
Glass of water, by the way.
And people should know, it's interesting, that back in the 19th century, designers of this building thought it was important enough at that time to recognize the Wolastoqey people with sculptures chiseled into the stone on the outside of this building, looking up and down the Wolastoq. It's been a privilege, Mr. Speaker, and is a privilege to serve the people of Fredericton-South as their representative and as a parliamentarian in this Legislative Assembly. It's been a privilege and is a privilege, Madam Speaker, to serve as an opposition leader in this Legislative Assembly and as a leader of the Green Party of New Brunswick. I respond to the throne speech today with not interest, but really puzzlement, because the throne speech, Madam Speaker, is supposed to be an opportunity for a government to outline its vision and priorities for the people of New Brunswick in the coming year. Ce discours de Trône est un document totalement dépourvu de contenu tourné vers l'avenir. Il ne contient pas les actions dont notre province a désespérément besoin pour relever la multitude de défis auxquels elle est confrontée. You know, looking at past throne speeches, there's been a devolution, Madam Speaker, in substance and content over the years, to the point where they became more full of spin and less full of suds. You go back to the throne speeches of, say, a Hatfield or a Robichaud. They actually laid out in detail the substance of what the government was planning to do for the year. In detail, with even budget items included in the throne speech, so it was clear to New Brunswickers what the plan was, what they could be looking for, what they could be counting on. But this throne speech contains none of that. Instead of the kind of bold initiatives New Brunswickers need to solve the problems that plague health care, the cost of living, housing, seniors' care, our climate, and the environment, we are presented with undertakings that represent those of a premier who seems, well, the epitome of one-person rule. And Madam Speaker, people have had enough of that. That's why in 2018, Madam Speaker, New Brunswickers elected a minority government. And that's why, Madam Speaker, whenever the election comes up, whether it's this year or next, they once again will elect a minority government, this time led by Greens, because they know, the more Greens in this legislature, the better things will get for them. You know, there's a sense of entitlement among Liberals and Conservatives that somehow only they, have the God-given right, through some kind of divine providence, to form government in this province. It's not true. It's not the case. There's nothing in their DNA, be them Liberal or Conservative, that enables them or makes them special in a way to form government. Not whatsoever. And you know, the people in this province who have had Green MLAs now for some years in their ridings know the kind of service Greens provide. While the throne speech may paint a picture of fiscal health and growth, we cannot be deceived and will not be deceived by the veneer of grandeur, for beneath it lies the grim reality of the unchecked power of this premier and a disregard for the well-being of New Brunswickers. Dans ce discours du trône, nous entendons parler de croissance économique et de développement, mais n'oublions pas qu'il ne peut y avoir de véritable progrès sans la participation réelle et le bien-être de tous les membres de la société. The Premier's promises of security, for example, are dangerous, because true security can only be achieved when a society is built upon the pillars of justice, accountability, and respect for democracy. While the throne speech purports to speak to all New Brunswickers, We've got to be vigilant to recognize that true unity in this province is not imposed through fear and coercion. It's forged through dialogue. It's forged through understanding and the respect for diversity, where all voices are heard and respected. This throne speech disregards the needs and voices of the many, the single parent or lone pensioners having difficulty making ends meet, the tenants who are losing their housing because they can't afford rent. And in my riding, Madam Speaker, for the first time in living memory, people are being driven out of their formerly affordable apartments onto the street and become homeless. The patients who are being treated and even forced to recover in hospital hallways, the seniors who need home care and better care in long-term care homes, and the families who can't find child care, and I think of those also who are subjected to air pollution that threatens their health. This speech fails to describe how the Premier intends to reconcile with Indigenous people. No sense whatsoever of how that's going to happen. Or to tackle systemic racism despite the report and the many recommendations made by the Systemic Racism Commissioner. Or how he might counter homophobia and transphobia that seems to be growing in our province, thanks to him. Or to stand against growing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Or advance the equality of our two linguistic communities. There's nary a mention of this in the throne speech. It's as if the Francophone and Acadian communities no longer exist in this province for this Premier. I see nothing that suggests he's even interested in trying to build bridges across the province or embracing New Brunswickers in all of their diversity. And that's worrisome. Our province deserves leadership that will do that, leadership that is accountable, transparent, and dedicated to the well-being of its people. Nous devons rester déterminés dans notre engagement envers les principes fondamentaux de la démocratie, de la justice et de l'égalité, même face aux tentatives d'un homme de les étouffer. When I say New Brunswick deserves leadership that is dedicated to the well-being of its people, I think of all those, Madam Speaker, who have contacted me in desperation, desperate, because they need to access a doctor or nurse practitioner or other health services, and they've been unable to. I can't believe that all members in this House, including on the government side, haven't had the same desperate constituents contacting them looking for help, because it's widespread and it's across the province. Lack of family doctor. They don't even know about MB HealthLink. They're still languishing on the old waiting list. Never got called to get transferred. I talked to people he would think would be able to be right on that, but had no idea that MB HealthLink exists, that they were supposed to be transferred from the old waiting list with no access to doctors, the new waiting list that is supposed to give them access to doctors, so they languish with no access to doctors. The inhumane wait times at the ERs, Madam Speaker, extraordinary. It's almost like this government is completely tone deaf to what's happening in the ER departments of our hospitals. My mother was up at the ER, taken by ambulance a while back, and when I got there, she was sitting in the waiting room with a blanket around here, and she's a nurse. And she said to me, "David, this is just inhumane," given the pain that she was in at the time. And that is a common experience with so many people who are in ERs. And then we have dangerous wait times for critical tests and surgeries. The Minister of Health likes to talk about the progress in reducing wait times for hip and knee surgeries, which is important for people, of course, who need hip and knee replacements. But what about cancer surgeries, Madam Speaker, or other surgeries that are equally important? Selon un récent sondage sur l'Association médicale canadienne, 42% des gens du Nouveau-Brunswick sont insatisfaits de la gestion du système de soins de santé par la province. Il s'agit de taux le plus élevé au Canada. 82% also stated that they believe health care has become worse in the province over the past 10 to 15 years, Madam Speaker. That's across governments of Premier Graham, Premier Allward, Premier Gallant, and this Premier Higgs, because they've failed to make the necessary investments and structural changes to fix our healthcare system, or prepare for the rapidly expanding number of New Brunswickers in their senior years, who we knew this was happening, and accommodate them in the healthcare system. Liberals and Conservatives alike have championed these team-based multidisciplinary family practices, where registered nurses, nurse practitioners, and other allied health professionals would be hired to work alongside doctors to take everyone off the waiting list by providing sufficient capacity to meet everyone's primary health care needs. This goes back to a report done for Premier Bernard Lord 20 years ago, and he's the one who first established some community health centers to create some of these team-based practices. But nothing substantive has happened since. But the throne speech, just like every other throne speech across Liberals and Conservatives, talked about looking at how to reduce the number of doctors in solo practices, saying we've got to reduce the number of doctors in solo practices, with no solution to do that. But, Madam Speaker, there is a concrete solution, a practical one, that will make it happen, and it's simply this. Right now, physicians have to pay out of their own pocket to hire nurse practitioners or a nutritionist or a technologist or a registered nurse or other allied health professionals to work in their family practices. That's why it's not happening. There needs to be a financing mechanism to pay for those nurses, those nurse practitioners and other health professionals to work with doctors in their family practices. We haven't got it, and there was no mention of it in the throne speech. Concrete, practical solution, and with $1 billion surplus, it certainly could have been put in place this current fiscal year. Le discours de Trône parle de soins de santé publique fiables, mais sous la direction de ce Premier ministre, notre système de santé est tout sauf fiable. En fait, il s'effondre. The government's promise to improve access to health care rings hollow when any mention of the funding that's necessary, the decentralization of management authority that's necessary to give hospital administrators some local authority to solve management problems with the doctors and nurses and other staff in their hospitals. It doesn't exist. Nurses and doctors in our province have single-handedly been trying to hold the healthcare system together through the sheer force of their will. And they've been doing this for so long, they're now leaving the bedside, burnt out, cynical, and, by the way, feeling overwhelmingly disrespected. I attended the annual meeting of family physicians, College of Family Physicians in this province, and the last one they had, and there was a leaders panel. So all the leaders of the parties were present, and including the Premier. And a doctor got up, a family physician got up, and he said, I've never been more disrespected by a government in my life. And, Madam Speaker, the applause by those physicians was thunderous. Let's look at the education system. The Premier says he wants to improve education, but then he trash talks the teachers. As more than one teacher has told me, they have never felt more disrespected by any government in their life when he publicly accused them of teaching their students to lie to parents. What a smear against teachers in this province. Such withering disrespect. And what a dog whistle that was to those New Brunswickers the Premier has made fearful about our education system, and to those whose hate he has fueled. For what reason, Madam Speaker? Why? To reap votes? Seriously? You know, I personally asked the Premier directly to publicly apologize to the teachers of this province, because I was getting emails from teachers in my constituency right after his comments were broadcast on the CBC, and I wrote them back and said, you know, coincidentally, I'm going to be seeing him at an event this evening. I'm going to go ask him to apologize. And I did ask him to apologize, and he refused. I tabled a motion asking for unanimous consent to immediately discuss the need for him to apologize to teachers in this House, and he refused to debate it yesterday. He was given the opportunity to make a public apology while speaking to the media on Wednesday, and he refused again. Ce n'est pas du leadership, il s'agit d'un Premier ministre déconnecté et égocentrique qui ne pense qu'à son héritage politique. Just look at how difficult it is for so many on fixed or modest incomes to make ends meet today. The high cost of rent, as I said earlier, is actually driving New Brunswickers now in homelessness. But the Premier won't reinstitute the rent cap, according to this speech from the throne, that he ripped away from tenants at the end of 2022, after only a year in place. How inhumane that was. I've been advocating, and our caucus has been advocating, for a permanent rent cap since 2018. We've had multiple bills to the legislature encouraging the Premier to implement one. And he's refused over and over again until that 1 year, and then took it away, because in the end it seems as if he values the ability of large property owners to maximize their profits over the well-being of tenants in this province, and that is a sad state of affairs. How are those, Madam Speaker, on a minimum wage at $14.75 an hour supposed to afford their rent? $14.75 is well below a living wage, which the Human Development Council in St. John now puts at about $20 per hour. How can they afford their rent? Never mind rent increases. Ce fossé doit être comblé afin que les gens puissent gagner un salaire décent qui leur permette de vivre. Les personnes contraintes de vivre de l'aide sociale sont en train de se noyer. Leurs revenus sont si faibles qu'ils ne peuvent pas se permettre de satisfaire les besoins essentiels de la vie. I don't know, Madam Speaker, how people forced to live on income assistance manage to get by. I just can't imagine how anyone can live on the meager funds that they're able to receive from social development. Sticking with affordability, you know, the Premier rails against the federal carbon tax as an unfair hit at the cost of living, failing to mention it's refunded every 3 months. In fact, I got mine just yesterday. Came in the mail. And it's not a prop, Madam Speaker, but just it's a note to tell me that it was $276. So I had a check waiting for me in my mailbox for $276 as a refund from the carbon tax program. But, Madam Speaker, there is no refund from the Premier's gas tax to implement the so-called carbon adjuster. That's revenue that goes to Irving Oil. Imagine being taxed by your own government to turn the revenue over to one of the wealthiest corporations in the country. That tax we need to axe. So what about people's security? Let's talk about security. The wild weather driven by the climate crisis is not only eroding our coasts and damaging property, but has been taking lives in our region. I'll never forget the lives of those Nova Scotian young people and children that were stolen by the flash floods after 250 millimeters of rain fell in a 24-hour period. They were trying to flee in their cars, in their vehicles. Unbelievable. And we've had plenty of warning. Because, as Madam Speaker, as you know, the first real storm like this that we've experienced in New Brunswick came in 2010 in Charlotte County. Our family was living in Warwick during that flooding. 166 millimeters of rain fell on that December the 13th, 2010. I had to wade through a raging torrent of water that washed away our lane to get to my family. Barely could stand up. My neighbor brought over his tractor and didn't dare go down into it for fear of what he might find underneath. Their homes moved off their foundations by brooks that became torrential rivers that couldn't be recovered and had to be abandoned. Homes, barns, and roads were so seriously damaged, the cost topping $13.8 million. And that was in 2010, 13 years ago. But this Premier, nor the Liberal one before him, have taken this seriously. They haven't even carried out the most fundamentally basic risk assessment to look at what areas of the province, what communities need the most assistance to help secure them against the consequences of the wild weather driven by climate crisis. This is the only way we'll know what level of security, what communities, what infrastructure, what New Brunswickers require to feel safe in the face of both this wild weather and rapidly eroding coastlines. We've got people's homes teetering on the cliffs in Caraquet, overlooking the Bay of Schiller because of rapid erosion. The road, the main road on Grand Manan, is getting washed out underneath because of rapid erosion, constantly having to be fixed on Castelia Bank. There are endless examples of this, Madam Speaker, endless examples across the province. Those are just two. But the work hasn't been done. There's no coastal defenses in place. There's no priority being placed on this. So when it comes to security in that sense, nothing has been committed to in this throne speech. Qu'en est-il de la sécurité alimentaire? Le discours du Trône met l'accent sur les exportations de produits agricoles et de fruits de mer du Nouveau-Brunswick, tout en omettant de mentionner que le Nouveau-Brunswick ne produit qu'un minuscule pourcentage des aliments que nous consommons. Le Premier ministre n'a aucun plan pour assurer aux gens du Nouveau-Brunswick un accès à des aliments locaux, sains et abordables, cultivés ici, même dans la province. The Premier at one point said he was interested in growing the local food system in New Brunswick to provide security back in the darkest days of COVID, and then dropped it. There was a real opportunity to build on that and come out of the pandemic with a growing local food system that would give us food security in the long term in this province, and he botched it. Any meaningful commitment to environmental protection in this throne speech is completely missing. It's as if the Premier doesn't recognize the Department of Environment has a regulatory responsibility, a legal responsibility, a statutory responsibility to protect the health of New Brunswickers from environmental contaminants and pollution. You would think the throne speech would at least reference the fire and the consequences of the fire at American Iron and Metal Corporation's car shredding operation in West St. John, where people were actually told by public health to shelter in place in their homes. Don't come out because the air is too toxic to breathe. Not a mention of this in the throne speech. How is that even possible? How tone deaf is that? How unbelievable, Madam Speaker, that those people's health that were put in such danger by not just the first fire, not just the second fire, but a third fire at that operation in West St. John, that this time was so large and so significant that public health told people to stay in their houses. And now they're telling them not to harvest the vegetables from their gardens because of potential contamination. Meanwhile, as the firefighters did such a great job of fighting that fire, all of that water washed those chemicals down into the harbor as well, further causing water pollution in the St. John harbor. So I don't know why the throne speech would not include initiatives to ensure not only that that disaster will never happen again, but any other environmental disaster like it will never happen again. It's almost as if there was a cone of silence in that section on the environment in the speech from the throne. And it maintains that cone of silence around the growing concern that there may be an environmental basis for the increased prevalence and clustering of neurological syndromes, like ALS. Recent research, Madam Speaker, has revealed that in New Brunswick, we're seeing clustering of ALS and an increased prevalence of ALS. And there's concern among those researchers that there's an environmental basis for that. Why is that not in this throne speech? Why is there no initiative to address this, to investigate this, to give some sense of security to New Brunswickers that government is on the job to protect their health from environmental contaminants? But no, nothing. It's like the environment exists somewhere away from people. It's just a place where you create protected areas, tree museums, Madam Speaker, that people can't even go visit easily. So the environment is all around us. And when it's contaminated, it threatens our health, whether it's the air, the water, our food. And it's not just this research, but we already are familiar with the clustering and prevalence of neurological syndromes that Dr. Marrero at the Mine Clinic in Moncton has identified, in addition to ALS, separate from ALS. These two things, two different researchers on parallel tracks are finding the same kinds of concerns with neurological degeneration, different diseases, and are looking at the real possibility that there's some kind of environmental basis going on. Le discours de Trône indique que le gouvernement publiera une stratégie énergétique provinciale qui présentera une voie vers un système énergétique plus propre. Si l'on en juge par les fonds consacrés au développement énergétique que le Premier ministre a ramenés d'Ottawa cette semaine, son intention est de soutenir l'une des formes de production d'électricité les plus coûteuses que nous connaissions, à savoir l'énergie nucléaire. You know, Madam Speaker, it's amazing that the Premier, the Minister of Energy, can use the words affordable and nuclear power in the same sentence with a straight face after our experience with Point Lepreau, that is responsible for 2/3 of MB Power's debt that everyone is concerned about, that this government says they're so concerned about, 2/3 of MB Power's debt, as the Auditor General found. And it's servicing this debt and the ongoing high costs of operating Point Lepreau that are driving up our power rates every year. That's the principal reason. It's like it's a dirty secret that government doesn't want to reveal, but it's the case because of their ideological, I guess, commitment to more nuclear power. So if we look at actual data on other sources that are less expensive, we know wind, solar, and energy storage systems are affordable and practical when managed with a smart electrical grid. And that's clearly what Premier Houston's vision for the energy transition in Nova Scotia is, and he's laid it out nicely. But certainly it's not Premier Higgs's vision for us. Nova Scotia, Madam Speaker, is embracing a renewable future to replace their coal plants. And there's no reason that New Brunswick shouldn't as well. Our own experts in the province have said in the past that essentially our province is like the Saudi Arabia of wind. But are we taking advantage of that? No. No. Sticking with the environment, the Throne speech references the new provincial forestry strategy entitled Our Forests Are for Everyone, which is actually a kind of a version of Bruce Northrup's 2013 forest strategy, only a strategy light, because it doesn't return the prohibitions on clear-cutting mature Acadian forest woodlands that Bruce Northrup, when he was Minister of Natural Resources, had put in place, or the cap on converting forests to tree farms. In fact, we'll expand tree farming, and if there's any mature Acadian forest left out there on the working landscape, Madam Speaker, it will get clear-cut. Son titre, les forêts sont destinées à nous tous, est ironique dans la mesure où le public n'a jamais été consulté sur les buts et les objectifs de la stratégie forestière, tels qu'arrête l'épandage d'herbicides comme le glyphosate, la limitation des coupes à blanc ou la protection de nos rivières contre l'envasement et l'érosion. It's legally required. Consultations were undertaken with First Nations, and as we know, those consultations founded on the rock. But, Madam Speaker, the rest of New Brunswickers, the general public, were left out. There was no way of engaging. There was no community consultations anywhere in the province that were open to the public to participate in, to lay out what their goals and objectives and hopes and aspirations are for how the Crown forests in this province are utilized. The Throne speech does point to a newly established Ministers and Chiefs Forestry Advisory Table. But as far as I know, there's no one at that table, Madam Speaker, because the Wolastoqey and the Mi'kmaq chiefs have refused to participate in that advisory table. They put forward the idea for discussion of shared management of the Crown lands. It's actually something we campaigned on the last couple of elections. But the government was not interested, not willing to discuss it. No way, no how. So this was given as the alternative, and they didn't bite, and I don't blame them. You know, much like the Premier, this throne speech spends most of its time looking at the past with no vision for the future. It speaks to the legacy, Madam Speaker, the Premier would like New Brunswickers to remember rather than the one people will actually remember. I think everyone's had enough. For example, the alienation of First Nations, dividing New Brunswickers over language and culture, dividing New Brunswickers over sexual orientation and gender identification, fear-mongering all the way along, whether it's on the Aboriginal title, claim, trying to instill fear in people that somehow they're going to lose their homes. It's crazy. The Madawaska First Nation had a big land title settlement that took in a lot of the city of Edmundston. No one lost their homes. No one lost their businesses. In fact, it was settled well, recognized, and with some of the revenue that compensation that was provided, Madawaska First Nation has developed new businesses that are employing not just Indigenous people, but people from across the Greater Edmundston region, creating local wealth in the community, creating local jobs. So it's just the opposite of what we're hearing. Think about his legacy around our healthcare system and treating our nurses and doctors respectfully. You know, going door to door, the last time we were able to do that during an election campaign, I could always pick out the nurses because I'd say, Madam Speaker, you know, what are your concerns? What are your priorities as we go into this election? And they would sort of stiffen and say, you don't want to know. You don't want to know. I said, no, I do want to know. Every one of those people were teachers when that happened. And they just would launch with a list of concerns and difficulties and challenges they're facing which have not been addressed. With the latest insult being really the bonuses for retention were provided in PEI in Nova Scotia to nurses there and not to nurses in New Brunswick. How about the legacy of ignoring the desperate lack of care staff in a nursing home? You know, at public accounts a little while back, the Deputy Minister said for the first time they're finally putting in place a strategy for retention and recruitment of nursing home care workers. For the first time. How could it be possible that this didn't exist before? How about this for legacy? Presiding over the greatest increase in homelessness in New Brunswick's history. We see it in our cities. We see it in our towns. St. Stephen. For the first time, people visibly homeless, living outdoors. Didn't happen before. And certainly in our cities, it was never on this scale. Never on this scale. And because of the scale now, despite the efforts of nonprofits and community organizations and churches to try and provide permanent housing for people, there's growing numbers of people who just are difficult to house without specialized housing with wraparound services 24 hours a day so they can stay housed and receive this kind of supports that they desperately need to remain under a roof. We don't have that. And then, of course, who will forget, Madam Speaker, the Premier's denial of the need for urgent climate action? Another part of the legacy. So, at a State of the Province address last winter, the Premier asked if he should stay or go. Many have told him that he should go. In September, he announced no, he wasn't going anywhere. He was staying. This throne speech fails to tell New Brunswickers where he intends to go with the province. So if he's staying, he won't tell us what he's going to do, which is kind of the point of the throne speech. It's a utilization of this historic practice in the Legislative Assembly and all parliaments in our Westminster system to lay out your plan in a throne speech. Why did he even have one if he had no plan to lay out or didn't want to lay out his plan? What was the point of the throne speech? I ask myself. Everyone else is asking themselves who's read it. So, Madam Speaker, this leaves me and everybody else in the province wondering then what it is that this Premier is going to take into an election, because that's what he's suggesting in his media comments. There's nothing in the throne speech because he doesn't want to reveal what he's going to take into the election. But he can't seem to make up his mind as to whether he's going to take us into an election or not. His indecisiveness has brought the workings of government to a halt. I have a lot of constituents who are civil servants, who are public servants, who do great work. And, you know, when they're off duty, I know lots of people. I know people. And they say, David, what's happening? Like, we're stuck. We can't do anything. Consultants who've been hired to support their work have been told, stop, stop, don't do your work. So everything has come to a crashing halt. It's not responsible. It's not leadership. And that's because of the Premier's indecision. At a time when so many are struggling in so many ways. I guess, Madam Speaker, all I can say is he needs to come clean, and he needs to come clean today. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for the thundering applause.